The wind came first, low and restless, carrying dust through the broken boards of the old mission chapel on the edge of the Dakota Plains. It whistled between the pews like a warning no one cared to hear. By noon, the wedding had begun. The preacher's voice trembled more from pity than piety, his Bible shaking in his hands as he looked at the young woman standing before him, her eyes covered by a strip of white cloth tied too tightly to be called a veil. Her name was Anna Lee, 19, pale as the frost that sometimes claimed the prairie early, though this was spring. Her father's hand pressed hard on her back, guiding her forward as if she were a horse being traded. The cloth over her eyes was meant to hide her shame, he'd said, to keep her from seeing what she didn't deserve. But in truth, it kept her from seeing the man she was being given to. A Lakota warrior named Talon of the Red Hills, standing silent at the altar, his broad frame cloaked in a dark wool coat, hair braided with a single hawk feather. He had not asked for a bride. He had been offered one, as part of a truce no one in this chapel believed would last. The girl was meant to be a symbol, her body sealing the deal between a tribe and a town that had spilled each other's blood for years. She stood trembling, her hands bound loosely by a ribbon of cloth. When the preacher said, "Do you take this man?" her father hissed, "Say it." Her voice broke against the wind. I do." Talon's eyes shifted, catching the tremor in her lip, the way her chin quivered beneath the blindfold. He did not answer when it came his turn. The silence stretched long enough that even the preacher faltered. Then Talon spoke, low, steady, the kind of voice that carried not in volume but in gravity. "She will not take me," he said in broken English, "until she sees who I am." Murmurs rippled through the small crowd, half settlers, half tribal men watching from the doorway. The father stepped forward, fury already climbing his neck. "She don't need to see nothin'. It's done." But Talon reached up, slow and deliberate, and untied the blindfold. The strip of cloth fluttered to the floor like a fallen feather. Anna blinked against the light, her lashes wet, her gaze meeting the man before her for the first time. He was nothing like what she had been told to fear. His eyes, dark and deep-set, were kind in a way that startled her, a sadness living inside them that matched her own. He spoke again, softer now, words thick with accent but clear enough to burn through the silence. "If she cannot see her life, I will give her mine." The preacher stared, uncertain whether to continue. The father spat on the ground. "You'll regret this, savage." But Talon didn't look away. "If sight is what she needs," he said quietly, "then take my eyes." The words were not a boast nor a metaphor to him. They were a vow. The girl's lips parted, the air trembling between them, and for the first time in her life, someone had spoken to her, as if her worth wasn't a debt to be paid. The wind outside shifted, softer now, curling through the open doorway like a promise that something sacred had just begun. By the time the vows were done, the sun had started its slow fall across the Dakota Plains, painting the sky in streaks of pale gold and dust. The preacher closed his Bible without blessing, and the guests, if they could be called that, scattered as if afraid to linger in the air left behind. Anna stood still, her fingers tracing the mark the blindfold had left on her skin. Her father was already gone, his boots crunching down the hill toward town, the silver coins of the dowry jingling faintly with each step. Only Talon remained beside her, silent as the wind that tugged at his coat. He did not touch her, not even when she swayed. Instead, he stepped towards the doorway and said softly, "You will come." It wasn't a command. It sounded more like a question meant for both of them. She hesitated, still half blind from the sudden light. her heart hammering against the ribs that had learned too well to stay still. "Where?" she asked, the word barely a breath. "Home," he answered simply, and for the first time, that word did not sound cruel. Outside, a painted pony waited, its reins looped over the porch rail, mane catching the evening light. Talon lifted a small bundle from the wagon, a blanket, a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, a worn canteen, and handed it to her. "You ride," he said. "I walk." Anna shook her head weakly. "No, I can walk." He studied her, then nodded once, untying the horse. They walked in silence down the narrow trail leading from the chapel, the grass whispering against their boots, the world around them vast and empty except for the slow rhythm of the wind and the soft creak of the saddle. When they reached the edge of the low ridge, Anna glanced back. The chapel was already small, a ghost against the horizon. "Did you mean it?" she asked suddenly. "What you said inside?" Talon kept his eyes forward. "I do not speak what I do not mean." She swallowed hard. "Then why say that about your eyes?" He slowed, picking up a small stick and snapping it absently in half. "Your people see what they want," he said finally. "Eyes lie easy, heart does not." His words hung in the air, heavy but true, like something older than both of them. They walked until the sun slipped behind the far hills, and the world turned to the blue of evening. A single hawk circled above them, its cry cutting through the silence. Anna's feet ached, but she did not complain. When she stumbled on a stone, Talon caught her elbow, steadying her with surprising gentleness. His hand was warm and calloused. And though he let go quickly, the memory of his touch stayed like a heartbeat against her skin. By the time they reached his camp, a small circle of stones beside a half-fallen cabin, the stars had come out. He lit a fire, the flame catching slow and steady, and gestured for her to sit. She obeyed, still clutching the bread she hadn't eaten. He spoke only once more that night. "Tomorrow you will see the hills from the high ridge. It is better to learn the land before you live on it." She nodded, staring at the fire until her eyes blurred with tears she didn't mean to shed. "I don't know how to start," she whispered. Talon looked up from where he was sharpening his knife, his expression unreadable. "Start with not fearing me," he said. Then he turned back to the fire, and for a moment she almost believed she could. The wind shifted again, carrying the faint smell of cedar smoke and rain, and somewhere deep inside her chest, something that had long been buried twitched, uncertain but alive. A seed of trust taking root in the ashes. The morning rose quiet and gray, with mist rolling down from the northern ridge like the breath of a sleeping god. Anna woke to the smell of smoke and pine, her blanket drawn halfway around her shoulders, though she did not remember covering herself. The fire from last night had burned low, but near it, Talon stood sharpening the edge of an old hatchet with slow, steady rhythm, the sound smooth and calm like water-cutting stone. He did not turn when she stirred, but his voice came low, quiet enough to blend with the wind. "There is coffee," he said, nodding toward a tin cup beside the coals. Anna reached for it, hands shaking slightly from the chill, her eyes lifting toward the outline of the hills that rose before them. They were red under the morning light, vast and untouched, stretching toward the clouds as if the earth itself had bled to make something beautiful. "You live out here alone?" she asked after a moment. He nodded once, still focused on the blade. "For many winters." "Why?" she asked softly. His hand paused, then resumed its motion. "Because peace is loud in town and quiet here." She didn't understand it fully, but something about his tone told her not to question further. When they finished their meal, a piece of bread each and a small strip of dried meat, he gathered the few things they had and began leading the horse up a narrow trail that twisted through the rocks. The path was rough, half covered in snow where the sun hadn't reached, but he walked as if the mountain had been carved with his footprints long ago. Anna followed, her skirts catching on brush, her breath coming quick in the cold. Every so often he'd glance back to see if she kept pace, saying nothing but slowing just enough for her to notice. After a long climb, they reached a plateau where the land opened into a sea of grass and sky. The wind caught her hair, blowing it free from the ribbon that tied it, and for the first time in weeks she didn't care to fix it. Talon stopped beside a flat boulder, resting his hand on it like a familiar friend. "This is Red Dawn," he said. "My mother's land. My father built a cabin here before the soldiers came." Anna turned, scanning the horizon, where a single chimney stood crooked against the light, smoke rising faintly from it, as if it had waited years for them to return. "You built that?" she asked. "No," he said. "I rebuilt what was left." She could hear the weight of the past in his voice, unspoken but heavy, like the mountain itself. When he moved closer, she tensed out of habit, but he only reached to take the ribbon from her hand, the same one that had once bound her wrists at the altar. For a heartbeat, she froze, unsure, but he lifted it carefully and tied it instead around her hair to keep it from the wind. "You should not wear the past like a chain," he said quietly. "Let it hold your hair, not your heart." She wanted to answer but couldn't find the words. Instead, she looked out across the valley, the blindfold still folded in her pocket, and wondered how something so small could carry both her shame and her freedom. He stood beside her, silent, the wind threading through the feather in his braid, and though no vow was spoken, she felt one forming between them, something wordless but binding. The plains stretched endless ahead, golden where the sun broke through the clouds, and for the first time, the world no longer seemed cruel. It simply waited for what they might build upon it. That night the wind came down hard from the ridges, shaking the thin boards of the rebuilt cabin until it groaned like an old ship at sea. Anna sat near the fire, her knees drawn close, the blindfold folded neatly beside her on the floor. She could not bring herself to burn it. Some part of her still believed that destroying it would erase more than pain. It would erase proof that she had survived. Talon moved about the cabin in silence, checking the latch, feeding the flames, his movements practiced and quiet. He had spoken little since they'd reached the cabin, but his silence was not cruel. It carried weight, not absence. When he finally sat across from her, the firelight caught in his eyes, and she saw a weariness that went beyond sleep. "You're thinking too loud," he said, the faintest trace of a smile in his voice. Anna's cheeks flushed, surprised that he'd noticed. "I'm not used to quiet," she admitted. "Where I came from, silence meant danger. If things went quiet, someone was about to shout." Talon nodded slowly, his gaze steady on the flames. "Silence here means peace," he said. "When the land stops talking, it means it trusts you." She looked around the cabin, the rough-hewn walls, the single table carved from pine, the fur pelts hanging near the door. "Does it trust you?" she asked softly. His eyes lifted, and for a moment the fire seemed to pause between them. "It used to," he said, voice low, "before men brought noise." He didn't have to explain which men. The scars on his forearms told their own stories. She stared at the flames, feeling both safe and small in his world. After a long silence, she whispered, "Why did you say those words at the altar? About your eyes?" Talon's jaw tightened. "Because I have seen too much," he said. If sight brings only pain, it is better to give it to someone who might see something good." The words struck something deep in her chest, a place where no kindness had lived before. She blinked fast, pretending to study the fire so he wouldn't see her tears. "You shouldn't have to give anything for me," she said. He leaned forward slightly. "You were given, not asked. That is already too much to take." His tone held no anger, only truth, and it made her throat ache. "Do you believe people can start over?" she asked. "Not like books or stories," he said. "People don't start over. They start again, carrying what they must, but lighter." The wind rattled the window then, and she flinched before she could stop herself. He noticed, but said nothing, just added another log to the fire. When she looked at him again, he was staring into the flames as though speaking to someone she could not see. "When my mother died," he murmured. The old women said her eyes stayed in the wind, watching over what she loved. "I think she sent you." Anna swallowed hard. "To do what?" "To make me remember that mercy is not weakness." His voice cracked slightly, the first time she'd heard it falter. The firelight trembled against the walls, wrapping them both in gold, and though neither moved closer, the space between them no longer felt like distance. It felt like waiting. Outside, the wind softened, settling into a lull that sounded almost like a sigh. Inside, two silences met and burned together until the cabin felt less like a refuge and more like a beginning. The days passed in a rhythm neither of them had planned. Mornings came cold and pale, the kind that turned breath into fog and silence into prayer. Anna learned to tend the small stove, to grind coffee beans with the heel of her hand, to listen for the difference between the cry of the hawk and the warning of the wind. Talon taught her without words, just gestures and patience, showing her where the snowdrifts hid dry kindling, how to mend a fence so the boards would not warp under rain. He spoke little, but when he did, his voice had the calm certainty of someone who had already buried too many ghosts to waste words on noise. By the fourth morning, the snow began to thaw, and the sound of dripping water filled the air like the ticking of a clock. Anna sat outside on the porch, brushing the dust from her skirt. When she saw a dark shape moving across the lower ridge, a horse, fast and deliberate. She stood, her heart clenching as it came closer. The rider wore a hat low over his face, a long brown coat snapping behind him like a flag. She knew that posture. No mountain man rode like that. Her father's men did. "Talon," she whispered, stepping back. He appeared at the door almost instantly, reading the fear on her face before she spoke. "Stay inside," he said quietly, reaching for the rifle that leaned against the wall. She shook her head. "He won't stop if he thinks I'm here." "Then he will learn to stop," Talon replied, his tone calm, but his stance turning solid as stone. The rider slowed when he reached the clearing, his horse snorting clouds into the cold air. "You've got something that don't belong to you," he called out, voice harsh and smug. "The girl." Talon said nothing, his hand resting loosely on the rifle, but not yet raising it. "She's not a thing to return," he answered. "She belongs where she's safe." The man spat into the snow. "Safe? You think this is safety? Hiding in some hut with a savage? Her daddy says she ran." Anna stepped out before Talon could stop her, her voice trembling but steady. "I didn't run. I was sold." The man laughed, cruel and sharp. "Call it what you want, miss. He sent me to fetch you." "Tell him I'm not for sale," she said. His grin faltered for a moment, but arrogance covered it fast. "You'll come, one way or another." Before he could take another step, the crack of Talon's rifle echoed across the valley. Not a bullet fired, but a warning shot that split the air and buried itself in the frozen bark of a tree beside the man's boot. The horse reared, shrieking. "Next step, no warning," Talon said quietly, eyes calm, voice steady as prayer. The rider cursed, jerking the reins. "This ain't over," he spat before turning the horse and galloping back down the trail. The echo faded, leaving only wind and the low thud of Anna's heartbeat. She stood frozen, her hands clenched around the hem of her shawl. Talon lowered the rifle, his breath misting in the cold. "He will tell others," she whispered. "Then they will come." "Let them," he said. "The land knows me better than they do." She wanted to protest, to tell him she couldn't bear to be the reason danger found him, but the words died when she saw the look in his eyes. Not anger, not fear, but something deeper. A quiet vow made to no one but himself. "You don't owe me this," she said finally. "I don't," he agreed softly. "But I choose it." The fire inside the cabin flickered through the open door behind them, a single thread of warmth against the vast cold, and Anna realized that for the first time in her life, someone's protection didn't come with a price. It came with peace. And peace, she thought, was worth any storm that might come down from the hills. The storm began without warning, sweeping across the plains like a punishment sent by something ancient and restless. The sky turned iron gray, and the first strike of thunder rolled through the valley before the wind found them. By dusk, the cabin shuddered under the weight of the rain. Talon had nailed the shutters tight, but the gaps in the wood let in ribbons of cold air that licked across the floor. Anna worked beside him, steady even as her fingers went numb, holding boards while he hammered. The sound was fierce, rhythmic, like a heart refusing to die. When the last window was covered, they stood in the dim orange glow of the fire, soaked to the bone and breathing hard. The storm howled outside, but inside there was stillness, fragile, human stillness. She looked toward him, water dripping from her hair. "How long will it last?" she asked. "Long enough to test what was built," he said, nodding toward the walls. "Storms always test." She smiled faintly. "And people?" "Them too," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "Especially people." Lightning flashed through the cracks, throwing their shadows huge against the wall. For a moment, it looked as though two giants stood inside that cabin, defying heaven itself. The rain hit harder, roaring on the roof until words became useless. Talon crossed to the fire, tossing in more wood, and when the wind forced smoke back into the room, he moved without thinking, pulling her close to shield her from the sparks. She froze, feeling the warmth of his chest, the rise and fall of his breath steady and sure. "You're trembling," he said softly. "From cold?" she lied. He let her go, though his hand lingered a heartbeat longer than needed, then turned to check the door latch again. Hours passed like that. Silence, thunder, the rhythm of the storm beating against the walls. At some point, Anna fell asleep in the chair near the fire, her head tilted slightly toward the window, the blindfold still folded in her lap. Talon watched her from across the room, the firelight catching the faint line of a scar along his jaw, a mark from another life he never spoke of. He thought of how she'd looked when she first arrived, eyes wide with fear, hands shaking, and how she sat now, calm even in chaos, a softness he hadn't seen since before the wars. He realized, with a kind of quiet awe, that the storm outside no longer frightened him. It was the quiet that did, the stillness that came when he looked at her and felt something he had no word for in English, something between mercy and belonging. Near midnight, a branch cracked against the roof with a sound like a gunshot. Anna startled awake. Talon was already at the door, pulling it open just long enough to look outside. "A tree fell near the ridge," he said. We fix it at dawn." She nodded, rubbing her eyes. "You should rest." He turned toward her, the corners of his mouth curving slightly. "You tell warriors to rest now?" "Only the tired ones," she said, smiling through the shadows. He chuckled, a sound rare enough to feel like a gift, and sat near the fire again, the storm easing to a steady rain. Neither spoke for a long time. When at last the thunder drifted away, Anna whispered, "The blindfold was meant to keep me from seeing shame, but I think it kept me from seeing grace." Talon looked at her quietly, his voice low and certain. "Then keep it no longer." She hesitated, then leaned forward and placed it into the fire. The cloth curled and blackened, a single thread catching the flame before it vanished into light. The storm ended with it, fading into silence so complete that it felt like a prayer answered. 3 days passed after the storm, the world washed clean and new. The grass that bent under ice now reached toward the light, and the air carried the smell of thawing earth. Anna woke early, drawn by the sound of wings overhead, ravens cutting through the quiet morning sky. Talon was already outside, his coat open, hair damp with mist, eyes turned toward the horizon where the trail wound down the ridge. Something in his stillness made her step closer. He held a small piece of folded paper, its edges worn, a red wax seal cracked open. "A rider left this near the stream," he said without looking at her. "No mark, but I know who sent it." Her pulse quickened. "From town?" He nodded once. "From the one who owns your name." The words felt heavy, as if spoken from another world entirely. She took the letter, her fingers brushing his, and unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was jagged, written by a man who carved words like he carved wood, with force, not care. It said only one thing. "You belong to no savage. The preacher will fix what was broken." Beneath it was a signature she hadn't seen in months. Her father's. The paper trembled in her hand, but she didn't cry. Not this time. "He means to come for me," she whispered. Talon said nothing, his jaw tightening as he looked toward the lower valley. "They ride with men who talk too much and listen too little." She folded the letter and tucked it into her apron, as though hiding it could change its meaning. "You should let me go," she said finally, her voice low, steady. "If they come, they'll bring guns, and I won't be the reason this place burns." Talon turned to her then, the lines in his face deeper than before. "You think you were the reason for what men do? You think cruelty waits for permission?" His tone was soft, but it broke her anyway. She looked down, ashamed, the blindfold's ghost pressing against her eyes again. "I just don't want you hurt." He took a slow breath. "When I said you would see through my eyes, I meant more than sight. I meant you would learn to stop closing them when the world calls you less." She looked up, meeting his gaze, and the firelight that always seemed to live there glimmered brighter. "And if I can't," she whispered, "then I will see for both of us," he said. The words should have sounded like pity. Instead, they sounded like faith. The wind shifted, carrying the distant clang of metal, a wagon, perhaps, far down the slope. The sound was faint but real. "They're already near," she said. "Then we will meet them before they reach the ridge," he answered. "I have no wish for battle, but I will not run from it." She wanted to stop him, to beg him to leave her behind, but the look in his eyes silenced every argument before it was born. "What if they take you?" she asked. "Then they will find they can't take what I already gave," he said, glancing at her hand, the same hand that had once trembled beneath a blindfold. "My peace." He turned toward the horse, checking its reins, while Anna stood frozen at the doorway, clutching the letter so tightly it tore along the crease. The sound of ripping paper echoed like thunder against the calm of morning. She didn't know if it was courage or fear that made her speak next. "If they come for me," she said, voice breaking, "I'll stand beside you." He stopped then, just for a moment, before nodding once. "Then you will see what strength looks like when it stands for something gentle." And as they walked toward the ridge together, the valley below bloomed gold under the rising sun, unaware that two people were about to turn it into sacred ground. By midday, the valley below shimmered in the heat rising from the thaw, a haze that made the riders seem like ghosts until they were nearly upon the ridge. There were 4 of them, her father among them, his coat too fine for the dirt he rode through, his face carved into something harder than she remembered. The preacher was beside him, Bible tucked beneath his arm like a weapon. The other 2 were men with rifles, hired for obedience more than conviction. Talon stood a few paces ahead of the cabin, his shadow stretched long over the dry grass, his hands empty. He hadn't taken his rifle. Anna's heart hammered in her chest as the riders stopped, the horses snorting clouds of breath into the still air. "That's far enough," Talon said, his voice steady, calm as the mountain itself. Her father sneered, dismounting with a heavy thud. "You think you can keep what isn't yours?" Talon didn't answer right away. "I keep only what came to me by choice." "She's a girl," her father snapped, "and you're a savage hiding behind her shame." He turned toward Anna then, his voice rising. "Get over here. You've made a fool of me once, but you'll not do it twice." The sound of his words broke something in her, something that had been dying quietly for years. She stepped forward, but not toward him. Her feet carried her to stand beside Talon, her skirts brushing his coat. "I'm not yours," she said. "Not now, not ever." Her father's face went red with rage. "You were bought." "No," she said softly, her voice trembling but sure. "I was given, but he gave me back myself." One of the riflemen raised his weapon, uncertain but eager. Talon lifted his hand, palm outward, a gesture of peace. "There is no war here," he said. "Only what you bring with you." The preacher shifted uncomfortably. "The girl's father has rights under the law." "Then your law is blind," Talon replied. "Maybe it needs my eyes." The words hung in the air like a prophecy, sharp and alive. Anna reached for his sleeve, whispering, "Don't." But her father was already shouting, "Take her!" The rifleman moved first, stepping forward, and then the world cracked open with the sound of thunder that wasn't from the sky. The gun fired, but the shot went wide, hitting a rock and splintering it into dust. In the same breath, Talon moved faster than she thought possible, wrenching the weapon from the man's hands and tossing it aside. "Enough," he said, his voice shaking with fury he hadn't let himself feel until now. "You've taken enough." Her father stumbled back, face pale, rage fading into fear. "You'll hang for this," he spat. "Maybe," Talon said, "but not before I teach you what it means to see." He stepped closer, not with threat, but with the weight of truth. And for the first time in his life, the man who'd sold his daughter could not meet another's eyes. The preacher raised a hand weakly. "Let it end here," he said. "No blood in God's light." Talon looked past him, toward Anna, then back at her father. "Then take your law," he said quietly, "and leave her peace." The old man hesitated, eyes darting between them, then turned sharply and mounted his horse. The others followed, silent, ashamed, until their shapes faded into the glare of the valley. When the last hoofbeat vanished, the silence returned. Deep, trembling, alive. Anna stood still, her breath shaking, until Talon finally looked at her. "They will not come again," he said. "Not while the wind remembers my name." She wanted to thank him, but words felt too small, so instead she took his hand. For a long time they stood there, their shadows bound in the dust, the valley below whispering through the grass like a hymn. That evening, the valley was quiet again, the air washed clean by the passing storm of men and pride. The sun dipped low, spreading gold across the land until the hills themselves seemed to burn. Anna stood by the river below the cabin, watching the water flash with light where it ran shallow over the stones. She knelt to touch it, cold and alive, and for the first time since she'd left the chapel, she felt the tremor in her hands slow. Behind her, Talon came down the slope carrying a pail, his steps soft enough that the earth barely seemed to feel them. He stopped beside her, setting the pail down. "You shouldn't wander alone," he said gently, not with the ground still wet. "I needed to see something that moved without fear," she replied, tracing her fingers through the current. "The river doesn't care what it's seen. It just keeps going." He crouched beside her, watching the water swirl around her fingers. "The river remembers," he said quietly. "It carries every storm, every leaf that falls. But it does not hold them. It lets them pass." She looked at him, and the fire of the sunset caught in his eyes. "I want to be like that," she said. "I want to let things pass." "Then start here," he said, reaching into the water and pulling up a small stone, smooth and pale from years of running. He placed it in her hand. "Throw it. Give it back to the water." She hesitated, feeling the weight of it, the simple roundness, the warmth from his touch. "And if it sinks?" she asked. "Then it learns peace," he answered. She drew her arm back and threw. The stone flashed once in the light, then disappeared beneath the surface, leaving only ripples. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The world was quiet except for the river's steady breath and the soft rustle of the reeds. "You've given me more than I can repay," she said finally. "You don't owe me thanks." "Then what do I owe you?" she asked. "Truth," he said simply. "The kind that doesn't hide." She looked down at her reflection, trembling in the water. "The truth is, I used to wish I hadn't been born." Her voice cracked on the last word, small and thin. "I thought God gave up on me." Talon's eyes softened, and his hand closed gently around her wrist. "Then maybe he sent someone who didn't." The river's sound deepened, as though the whole world had taken a breath at once. Tears filled her eyes, not from pain but from something wider, like light breaking through a long closed door. "When I was blindfolded," she whispered, "I prayed that if I ever saw again, it would be something worth looking at. I think this is it." Talon smiled faintly. Then the prayer was answered. The last of the sunlight faded, turning the river silver. He stood and offered her his hand. She took it, rising slowly, her fingers slipping into his as though they'd always known how to fit. Together they climbed back up the ridge, the sky above them bleeding into twilight. The first stars began to appear, timid but steady, like small promises that the dark could never fully win. When they reached the cabin, Anna paused, turning to look back at the valley below. The river glowed faintly, catching the last trace of light, and for a heartbeat it looked like a ribbon of fire weaving through the earth. She smiled softly. "The river of light," she murmured. "Your eyes saw it first." Talon shook his head. "No," he said quietly, looking at her. "Now yours do." And though night was falling, the world around them seemed brighter than it had ever been. The morning came soft and silver, the kind that made the world look washed clean of everything it had once carried. Mist curled low across the grass, and the air held that quiet before birds begin to sing. The quiet that feels like forgiveness. Anna stood on the porch wrapped in Talon's old wool blanket, watching the first light touch the peaks beyond red dawn. The valley below still shimmered with dew, every drop catching the light like a promise. Inside, she could hear him moving, slow and deliberate, as if afraid to wake the world too quickly. When he stepped out, the sunrise hit his face, and for a moment he looked almost unreal, half shadow, half light, like something the mountain had decided to keep. "You didn't sleep," he said. "No," she whispered. "I was afraid if I closed my eyes, I'd wake in the chapel again." He shook his head. His expression softer than she'd ever seen. "That place is gone." She looked down at her hands, still marked faintly by the rope that had once held the blindfold. "I used to think blindness was the worst kind of prison," she said, "but it wasn't. It was believing what they told me I was." He nodded, his voice low. "They took your sight for their comfort. You found your vision for your own." She smiled faintly. "Then maybe I don't need your eyes after all." "No," he said quietly. "But you have them anyway." The words made her laugh, a soft, trembling sound that startled them both. The sun rose higher, and the mist began to lift, revealing the ridge trail, the river flashing gold beneath it, and far beyond, the faint line where the world ended and heaven began. "What will you do now?" he asked. She turned toward him, her face glowing in the dawn. "Live," she said, "and see everything." He watched her a moment longer, then handed her something, a small strip of blackened cloth, the edge frayed from flame. "You kept this," she murmured. "It was part of your story," he said. "Now it can rest." She held it in her palm, the fabric still carrying the faint scent of smoke, and let the wind take it. It rose, twisting once before catching the light and vanishing into the sky. For a long time they said nothing. The world didn't need their words. It was already speaking through the rustle of grass, the hum of the river, the rhythm of two heartbeats that had learned the same silence. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, certain. "You said once that eyes lie easy." "They do," he said. "Then tell me what you see now." He looked at her. At the light behind her, at the land that had once been red with loss and was now gold with promise. "I see peace," he said, "and I see it looking back at me." Her eyes filled, not with sorrow but with something cleaner, something she didn't have to name. She reached for his hand, and together they watched the sun climb, its light spilling over the mountains like grace. The wind moved through the grass in waves, carrying the last trace of smoke, the last shadow of the blindfold, until there was only morning, clear, open, and free. And as the first songbird broke the silence, the world began again. No vows, no bindings, no fear, just sight. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true-hearted frontier tales. Tell us in the comments, if someone offered you their eyes so you could finally see the truth, would you have taken them? Because sometimes mercy doesn't come from heaven. It comes from someone who's already walked through the fire and still chooses to see light.